Hong Kong loves to protest.
The pictures are simply incredible.
Pack the streets of downtown Hong Kong.
Protests in Hong Kong are frequent and noticeable. It seems that since its inception, it's been protesting non-stop. This is interesting, considering Hong Kong is located in, well, China, an area of the world renowned for political oppression. But is it really located in China? Does this scream China to you? And in this wealthy, seemingly utopian city, well, what are they even protesting? For the most part, Hong Kong is China, kind of. It's a special administrative region located here, and in June, I was here. So behind me is Victoria Harbour, and unbelievably this was still part of the United Kingdom until 21 years ago as of yesterday. It was part of the UK for hundreds of years and served as one of the most important shipping routes in all of Asia, especially on the South China Sea. The British controlled this strategic port for over 150 years, and with its communist neighbour just a few miles away, it grew to be one of the most developed cities on the entire planet. However, in 1997, Britain's lease on Hong Kong was up, and this is when the issues really began to surface. Hong Kongers were fearful of direct Chinese rule, and the British were unequivocally aware of this, so they negotiated an unprecedented deal, a deal now known today as the One Country, Two Systems Agreement. This means that Hong Kong, for all intents and purposes, is part of China. However, it has a significant degree of autonomy, controlling its own economic and social systems, and most importantly, their own elections. Alongside this, Hong Kong has built up its own culture, influenced by both Chinese and Western cultures, and on the whole, this city flourishes, with most residents enjoying an extremely high quality of life. Yet despite this, their populace is still protesting, and this is because they are worried about the integrity of their fragile democracy. So like in most countries, there are two clear sides within the political theatre. In countries like the USA and the UK, it's left versus right. But for most of Hong Kong's history, it has been a battle between the parties that are pro-China and the parties that are labelled pro-democracy. The pro-Beijing camp, often favouring closer relations with China, are often seen as puppets of their neighbours, and the intriguingly named pro-democracy camp are a collection of parties vaguely aligned with the idea of liberal values such as human rights, civil liberties and social justice, yet their unity stems from their dissatisfaction with the state of democracy in Hong Kong. So behind me is Hong Kong's legislative building. This is Hong Kong's version of the Houses of Parliament in the UK or Capitol Hill in the US. There are 70 delegates based here, 35 are elected through what's called geographic constituencies. There are 5 big geographic constituencies here in Hong Kong, and they are given a total number of seats depending on the population of those areas. For example, here in Hong Kong Island there are 5 seats given out, and come election time these seats are given out proportionately depending on the amount of votes counted. The other 35 seats are elected through something called functional constituencies. These are industries or areas of the community that elect representatives to represent them. There are people such as people representing the medical industry, the labour unions or education, and more scary ones like the finance industry and the legal industry. Whilst these functional constituencies sound, well, functional, picture this. In an alternative UK, we elect half our MPs through our current format, democratically. However, the other half are elected through functional constituencies. Imagine if one of the MPs elected is Mr. Alan Sugar, elected by 507 of the top financial executives. There would be uproar, and this is the case in Hong Kong. Take a look. A member in the geographic constituencies speaks for around 110,000 people, but some of these members in the functional constituencies are elected by just a few thousand. But this goes even further. 6 seats in the functional constituencies are uncontested, meaning these MPs who are not actually elected hold the same power as those who were. And this is a massive deal, because these functional constituencies almost always overwhelmingly back China. In 2012, the pro-democracy camp won 56% of the vote in these geographic constituencies, receiving a majority of these seats. However, the functionals eclipsed this victory, leaving the pro-democrats firmly within the minority. This has been the case for pretty much every election in Hong Kong's history, and it has people infuriated.
Last night there were clashes between protesters and the authorities.
Chinese pro-democracy demonstrators have taken to the streets in Hong Kong.
This problem, however, is just the tip of the iceberg. The heavy hand of China seems to pervade much deeper than this. I was in Hong Kong on July the 1st, the anniversary of the day the sovereignty of Hong Kong was transferred from Britain to China, and each year, on this day they hold peaceful protests on this street. And in talking to the pan-democratic parties here, one thing kept coming up.
One person can have one vote in the Legislative Council as well as the Chief Executive's election.
This is the Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam. She's the head of government and is elected by a little over 1,000 people, the 70 legislative members, and a mix of business and trade elites. Here we can see, on full display, China discreetly pulling the strings, keeping their trustees in power. The Chinese overwhelmingly backed Lam, even threatening to not allow her competitor to win. And this is the issue that causes protests like these.
Breaking the truce here.
Protests in Hong Kong are common, but the Umbrella Revolution of 2014 was immense. Central areas of Hong Kong were occupied for months, with the youth-led movement calling for the direct election of their leader, abolition of functional constituencies, and the resignation of the divisive chief executive. These protests amounted to little change, the only change being a rift within the pan-democratic camp, with a new faction emerging, the localists. The localists are a collection of parties that believe the pan-democrats don't go far enough. This new faction believes in a clear Hong Kong identity and see Hong Kong as a completely separate political entity, with some going as far as to call for Hong Kong's independence. These groups are driven by youth voters, many of whom identify strongly with a modern, progressive Hong Kong. This scores a line under the main divide within the electorate: age. Young people tend to vote for the pan-democrats or localists, whilst the elderly tend to favour pro-Beijing candidates, and Hong Kongers claim that this is another example of their democracy being infringed upon, with the pro-Beijing candidates campaigning aggressively and often pervasively towards the elderly. There are reports of them even being driven to polling stations and being instructed on who to vote for. A lot of these localist groups are also relatively right-wing, with some developing an anti-immigration stance. They claim that the influx of wealthy Chinese mainlanders are driving up house prices, which they see as the reason for Hong Kong's shocking housing crisis, in which the average home costs 20 times the average annual salary. The localists garnered significant support in the 2016 election, but their lack of functional constituency ports left them fairly high and dry. But the government seems fearful of their rise. On the charges of radical localism, they are accused of organising violent protests and separatism. They have been swiftly prosecuted and a lot of them imprisoned over the past years. The localists' rise seems striking, but time is running out. Part of the agreement with the UK was that this one country, two systems deal was only temporary, and that in 2047, 50 years after the handover, Hong Kong was to become part of China, proper. And
and this has Hong Kongers afraid. Hong Kong has developed a completely separate identity to China, a completely separate social system, and a practically opposite economic system. Hong Kong is a pillar of free market economics. The sparkly skyscrapers of multinational companies dominate the skyline, whilst just over the border, the world's largest communist nation looms large, and its grip tightens by the day. The deadline is imminent, and the question of how these two systems will become one country remains unanswered, and Hong Kong's future remains in the hands of the all-powerful, ever-encroaching Chinese.